Okay, it looks like we're live.
We're live.
Yes. Oh,
Hi,
that
guys.
means that.
Hi, come on, let's have your questions. You can ask us anything. Anything you like.
And what will happen is if the questions are okay and they're fine, I will give them links and they can come up on the panel.
That's good.
Yeah, if they want to chat to us, that'd be nice.
Well, of course they do. They've been very vocal in some cases, calling us all sorts of strange names. Some I didn't even know. I had to look them up in the dictionary.
Well, they come up with new words every year, right?
Oh, yeah, we do. Yeah. That's part of the fun of it, really.
Yeah, well, it's interesting here that we had this this fella here, which I'll put up. Ask us anything unless your name is G. Corell. I want to ask you out there, anyone, do you know who a Corell is? We know a Gorell, but we do not know a Corell. So I guess he couldn't even spell his name correctly this time.
Well, let's see if he's prepared to put his face up there as well. Be interesting to see what it is. Oh, one point maybe we should clarify. There's certain debate about S-star films, and the film that we used wasn't the correct film because it wasn't S-star based. S-star is short for the word polyester. Polyester is a form of plastic, and it's just the backing of the film. Makes no difference to it. And there's some very strange things coming up about this film, that Kodak produced this wonderful film that could work under these adverse conditions, but they never put it on the market. They never sold it as a commercial product. It was all developed for NASA so they could go and photograph stuff on the moon, we're told. Anyway, S-star based film. Oh, hang on a minute, we've got a question here. Do you have a reference where I can read the quote where the SR-71 pilot who turned off his cabin lights and could easily see by starlight? I would very much like to see the primary reference. Okay, it's in a book called Sled Driver, S-L-E-D, Sled Driver. That was the name that a lot of the SR-71 Blackbird pilots used. They were sled drivers. So it's in the book Sled Driver. To be on the top of my head, I can't remember the author, but he was an SR-71 pilot and wrote what I think is the definitive work on the operation of the SR-71 during the Vietnam War, when they were flying over from California, refueled twice on the way across, photographed the sites that were required, then flew back again across the Pacific to California. Had to be refueled twice. But on the journey back from Vietnam to California, it was a bit boring. They were going at about Mach 2, about 2,000 miles an hour. And this pilot said, I just wanted to see what the canopy of stars looked like. So he, for a few minutes, turned off his cabin lights. And once his eyes had adjusted, he could read his instruments from starlight. They were flying at about 60 to 70,000 feet. And he said it was the most wonderful sight I'd ever seen. So it's in the book Sled Driver. That's the reference. And I could come up with the name of the author, but if you put it into Google, you'll probably find it. Sled Driver, about the SR-71.
Absolutely amazing, Marcus, how you just have that wealth of information at your fingertips that you can just call on that.
Well,
I'm always amazed how you can just pull history out of a box. Your memory, like when I'm looking stuff up, it doesn't matter how much stuff I've read, I still have to go back and look it up again. I just can't pull names and dates and times and everything out of my hat,
Okay.
There's another thing that I would also like to show here, and that is Newton's third law does not function in space, so propulsion is out. Well, I'd like to answer that question with an experiment that I did myself in our vacuum chamber. I put an Estes rocket in that chamber while I left the pump running at full blast so that it could get the smoke out, everything else, so it would be more like space. And that rocket took off like a flash. I've also seen others that have done the same thing, and they've used extended tubes. If you sit in a chair and you have a medicine ball and you toss that medicine ball, it's the same thing. You're going to go backwards and that ball's going to go forward. So yes, it will. You will get the kick from that motion, right? You have to. You have a action. You get an opposite reaction. So what happens in the rockets? They take their own fuel and oxidizer with them. Without the oxidizer, no, it won't work. It'll just spray out the back at whatever the turbo pump can kick it out at, and it's not going anywhere until that oxidizer is used. And now you have a nice fire where it can expand at the proper rate. It does lose efficiency, though, when it reaches space. When it reaches the Kármán line, it starts to lose a little bit of efficiency. I don't remember what that was, but Elon Musk had made a statement about that. So yes, the rockets do function in space.
Yep. Newton's third law: for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I see there's an interesting comment on Mars, how we get such clear pictures from Mars but not from the Apollo sites.
Yep.
You know, I guess those people are nearsighted or whatever. They can't get it to focus. The fact of the matter is my personal opinion on that is I think they're just faking everything when it comes to the Mars photographs and stuff.
This one, Lewis. I like this one, Lewis Watto. Miracle film. Imagine producing a film that can make it through the X-ray machines at the airport. Well, we would have loved that back in the 70s, wouldn't we?
Yeah, exactly. It was well known that X-ray machines would damage photographic film, which is why most professional photographers had their little lead-lined pouches if they had to put it through the machine. But they preferred to ask the operators to hand search their material and not put it through the machine. I mean, it's not rocket science, this. X-rays damage photographic film.
Just like I showed when I put that roll of film outside the microwave oven. Mind you, that's not space. I get that, you know. I understand that what the NASA proponents are claiming, but it still gave that film a 1 second blast sitting outside the door. And what I did was I jammed these door switches so that the magnetron would turn on, because you can't just open your door and do that. So I had to make sure that the switches were jammed so that the oven would turn on. I gave it 1 second, and you've seen in the videos what it's done to that film. It's just fogged it right out.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen when cosmic rays are hitting this film and everything else is hitting this?
And the other thing about the film, of course, was the temperature. Imagine having a film that is so stable that you could just throw it on the dash in your car. You're at the beach, you're taking photographs, right? You're changing film up and you can just throw it in the car and the car's heating up in the sun, right? When you're at the beach, especially if you're in California, right? It's going to get pretty hot in there. You imagine having film that can handle that temperature without having an effect on it. I mean, it would have been very practical had they manufactured a film that was that stable to not use it, right? And this is the whole thing. This is the whole thing. And of course, the film that they actually were using was quite a bit thinner than film that you were buying, right? Just so they could have the extra images on that roll. So it's even more delicate what they were using.
And I noticed somebody has made the point that Kodak, when they made the films, the SO268, I think it was, special order, they put coating onto the film to protect from the temperature and from the radiation. Well, that's a new one. I never heard that said before. So maybe somebody can come up with a reference to it.
When I was looking up the film development and what they had available at the time, it was 75 or 6 before they even put a UV coating on them.
Yep.
And well into the later 70s when they had for infrared and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you talk to anybody that worked with film during that time period, right, when they're working with it, they have a Faraday cage.
That's film.
Just
photographic film.
Yeah. Like if you look at anybody that was working with it and doing special effects or anything else, right, they had to have a Faraday cage just for the ambient radiation around in the building, coming off the lights, coming off equipment in the building, right? It's that delicate. And of course, that is so very little, and it's affecting it at that rate. If they had something that would work on film, right, it would not only stabilize it, you wouldn't have an expiry date on it either.
Yeah, good point. The expiry date is there for the background radiation damaging the film, and Kodak and Agfa and Ilfa and Fuji didn't want people to complain if they kept film for a long time and it came out damaged.
That's right. Even the packaging of it was for that radiation around, like that was an actual Faraday cage, that packaging with the wire in it, right?
Yeah, I'd like to answer this one. It says Jay McGribb said, "Do you guys think that Mars rovers and other space missions will be faked?" Well, I'll tell you, I don't really think they will now. I mean, it's 2024 after all, and I don't think they're going to be faked because we've already seen what's happening. For example, they cannot get this Artemis mission to the lunar surface. They can't even get humans around the moon. All they can do is send dummies. That's it. So if you want to put 3 dummies in there instead of 2, like they did with Apollo, then be my guest. But no, I don't think they need to fake it anymore because they're showing that they cannot do it right now.
Yeah, there's a very big difference between humans in space, us delicate little creatures, and equipment manufactured by humans. They understand they have sufficient knowledge to be able to protect electronic equipment in space, but they don't have enough knowledge to protect humans in space. And that is the difference. So the Mars missions are quite likely to be for real. The Mars rovers are quite likely to be for real. What's the point of faking them? They can get there. We know that rockets can leave Earth orbit, can go into deep space. We've seen enough of them doing it. But humans doing that is a very different story, and that is the point we're making.
Well, I think they still have a problem with communications at distances as well. They might have solved that. They might have solved that if they can get a radio signal within a laser.
Yeah,
that seems to be working. Isn't China working on some of that stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that makes a big difference. And if they're now doing that, what were they doing before that they needed to do this, right? Yeah. How are they communicating if this is the way they're communicating now?
Right? Here's another good one here. So you have Tinker Terrible. Hi, Tinker. How are you? Is there any way that a spacesuit construction could survive outgassing? What would it have to be made of? Well, it would have to be made of something that doesn't outgas. That would be the first thing. Any ideas, Marcus? Any thought?
Good point. Good question, actually. Interesting question. Because spacesuits are made from different material to spacecraft. Spacecraft usually have metals, aluminium, tungsten, chromium, the hard metals, but you can't make a spacesuit out of aluminium. Well, unless you're in the movie industry, you can, I suppose. So spacesuits would not only outgas, but they would have to hold the vacuum hold against the vacuum of space from the pressure inside the spacesuit. I think this is an interesting point. And maybe this is why that, what's the name of the company that was recently withdrew from the spacesuit manufacturing? Is it Axiom?
Collins.
That's right, Collins, that's right. So why don't they ask the people who made the original Apollo spacesuits? You know, International Latex Corporation. They used to make bras because they were stretch material. Very good company to approach. And they did a good job because they appear to work. So why don't they use those? And you've shown in the films, Robert, many of the Apollo spacesuits being hung up on racks. Well, surely renovating them isn't a problem. They managed to renovate.
That's a pretty strong boy that's able to put those up there, because the spacesuits are like 45 pounds a piece.
Yeah, they're quite heavy.
They're swinging them around like there's no weight to them at all. The thing with the outgassing, I think, with the spacesuits is it's not going to happen instantly. It's going to be over time.
Yeah.
Okay. And with the different materials, each one is going to have a different time when it's going to start to break down. Pretty much any man-made material has a problem with outgassing because of the atomic oxygen that's embedded into it when it's being manufactured.
Yeah.
That's one of the first problems that they have with it. But yeah, you're gonna have depending on how much temperature it's dealing with, from heat to cold, right? That's going to help break it down. All of those things are a factor, and then just over time.
Hi, Randy.
Hello, Randy. How are you doing?
Guys, just 1 sec.
Oh, he's gone again. Interesting question about David Bryant. His book, Our Forbidden Moon, published several years ago. And he does describe many of the things that we discuss here. And specifically that location where some of the landings may well have been filmed in the UK at Cardington Airship Hangars, still used today as film studios for big productions. Interesting story, that one. So David Bryant, he's based in the UK and has written about the faking of the moon landings. Very interesting book. Our Forbidden Moon, the title. There we go. The answer to that question is yes. They appear to be similar to the Apollo 17. I think it's the North Massive. The shape is very similar. And if I had it with me right now, I'd show you the book. I've got David Bryant's book. I've read it. It's a very good book, worth looking at.
And then we have Paul Francis. He says, how can NASA say the landing sites are now heritage sites? Well, that's another good question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if they're heritage sites, then why is NASA flying over them, taking pictures with this supposed LRO? I wonder, actually, with the Chinese, I wonder if or how far they have to keep away from that landing site. Do you have any idea, Randy? Any comment on that?
Sorry, give me that. First of all, sorry for being late, guys. I had some technical problems, but I think I worked it out anyway. So home Marcus, Scott, and Robert, how are you?
We're doing great.
Good. Robert, what was the question again?
Yeah, how can NASA say the landing sites are now heritage sites?
That's an easy answer. They just want to keep people, other countries, away from it because there's nothing there.
Well, other than the fact that every other heritage site in the United States they make money off of for tourism, right?
I don't think NASA's concerned about making money on this. I think they're concerned about some intrepid millionaire with the technology and the backing and the resources to land, or a billionaire to land an unmanned probe on the moon, call it what you want. I decide Apollo 11 only to find out there's nothing there. So I think NASA's, in this particular case, I'd say NASA's last concern is about money. I'd say it's more about just don't want people to find out the truth.
Sounds like a James Bond
it's also
movie.
interesting that, pardon?
Sounds like a James Bond movie. A billionaire moonraker.
Yeah.
Well, I hear all these
Create
silly
your own
arguments.
society.
I hear all these silly arguments about the LRO, and the reason why the photos are not as they don't have the definition and they don't have the high resolution in them. And I'm coming from a point of view of a layperson. I'm not a photography expert, but anybody who has eyes can see, and common sense can see what's really going on here. So I have all these excuses that, well, they didn't go there to photograph the Apollo landing sites. They went there to survey the moon and other areas of the moon. I'm thinking, why not? Why not include high resolution photos of the Apollo landing sites as they do with other areas of the lunar surface? And the excuses are lame. I mean, is that evidence of a smoking gun? No, but it certainly does raise some curiosity, and it gets people asking questions, right? Why wouldn't you spend the extra dollars to use the same freaking camera that you've used on other areas of the moon, and use that camera and that technology to take photographs of the Apollo landing sites? So none of the proponents' arguments add up here. None. So it's just a silly game that people are playing. Anybody with common sense and anybody with eyes can see that those photos are nowhere near the quality of the photos or the resolution that from other shots of the lunar surface. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. And then we have the Cockmeister. He says, what do you guys think of the Bart Sabirl film, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon? The third person talking in the transfer on the window of the Earth, with Apollo allegedly being halfway there. Well, my take on that is this. I think that it wasn't, I don't think it was a transparency that they put up there. I think what it was the actual ball, or the Earth that they had sitting out there was actually quite big. So when they pulled the camera back, because it was at the back of the craft, and now it looks like that's the Earth. It's the same way they do on the International Space Station with the with the lens, with that fisheye lens. So the window's acting like a fisheye lens, and now it's looking like the Earth. But as soon as they opened, as soon as that one astronaut moved away from the window, I think it was Collins, when he moved away from the window, all of a sudden, guess what? Now you see the whole full blueness of the Earth, because it's so big, because they're only in low Earth orbit. And that's that's simple how they did that. They didn't need any transparent. They didn't need anything except an Earth outside. Or they could have done it in low Earth orbit. That's what I think. And when they pulled the camera back, opened it up, now you have the Earth there, because the window's acting like a fisheye lens. So that would be my take on it. So I still think they were in low Earth orbit myself.
It's as far as they could go anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's a possibility. I don't discount that. I personally think that they weren't in low Earth orbit because, in my opinion, it was risky to put a crew on board a Saturn V with those 5 unstable F1 engines. But that's my opinion. That's just, from what I've read and researched and have written about. I think it would have been absolutely insane to do that. And now, if there was another way they got them into low Earth orbit with a Saturn 1B without another launch that was classified, I don't know. But
they could have throttled the engines down too. That was another suggestion I think Scott made, didn't they? Didn't you, Scott? They just throttled the engines down. They didn't use it.
I think without the full payload, because they weren't going anywhere, that they throttled those F1 engines down just for that launch to stabilize.
I don't think they did that, they would have to throttle it down before the launch. Like, I don't think they can
Yeah,
actually
before.
control the thrust before. But how about Bill Casing's original idea that they use completely different engines in the Saturn V configuration? I mean, that's a possibility too. I just do not believe that even NASA would be that stupid to put a crew on board a rocket that had 2 minutes of total testing, equivalent to what, 10 minutes by the time Apollo 11 went, of total in-flight testing. I'm not talking about static testing, but I'm talking about in-flight testing of the F1 engines, which NASA admits that they had problems with, because they did make modifications to the F1 engines after the launch of the near disastrous launch of Apollo 6. And then, of course, they went straight from the unmanned launch several months later to a manned launch. So if they were in low Earth orbit, and I'm leaving that possibility open, if Apollo 11 did manage to get to low Earth orbit, just like Apollo 7, because Apollo 7 was a Saturn 1B launch, right? So if they did launch a crew, number one, wasn't with the F1 engine. Number two, it was a classified launch we didn't know about, but of course the Soviets would have known about it. But we all know that they knew more and were keeping quiet. Or number three, it was, as Scott says, a throttled back version of the F1, which I think is highly unlikely. But number four, it would be with different engines using the Saturn V configuration. It's a possibility, right? It is speculation. Possibility.
What gives me cause to think they were using an F1 engine is because of the actual sound level that rocket produced.
Well, we got that sound level from CBS. Okay, so I mean, where's that data coming from? And that's another question. I just don't trust anything
NASA
coming out of
says
NASA.
that NASA says it was 205 decibels.
NASA says that's the
Yeah.
key. NASA says.
Yeah, but the crowd was also back 10 kilometers, and they're recording 134 decibels at 10 kilometers.
Right, but you just said that the engines were throttled back. So how much sound would
They still make
is
the
that in
same.
relation to a
They're
full
still
sound?
making the same volume.
Right.
And if you put a human in there, it's going to kill them.
Right. But again, it goes back to do we trust what we're hearing, the information that's coming out, not only from NASA, but from people, spectators that were there, that were designated to take readings, and only those readings would be screened by NASA and the mainstream media before they're released to the public. So I have to cast doubt on that. But I mean, it's possible, right? But I'm just casting doubt on it.
I'm just saying the risk, just the sound volume alone for the Saturn V rockets launching, the ones that they launched, it would be absolutely ridiculous to put humans inside of it. Not only that, if they actually throttle those up to full throttle, it's going to hit that pogo effect.
Yeah.
Right.
But they would have to do some
Scott,
engineering. They would have to do some engineering, and that's several months. If they were using the F1 engines, they would have to do additional engineering and modifications in order to get the thrust vector they want, because they can't change that thrust vector when they're in the launch, right? They would have to. I'm assuming they would have to. I haven't dived into this aspect of it enough, but I'm assuming they would have to have that stabilized before they would launch, which require more launches, because now you're launching a Saturn V with reduced thrust. So you have to make sure that you have stability in terms of all 5 engines firing at the same time and firing equal thrust, because as you will agree yourself, if you get you get differing thrust vectors, and then you have different frequencies, and then you have pogo effect of the Saturn V. So there would be a lot involved in launching a rocket just with reduced the F1 engines, just with reduced thrust. It's a possibility, but I'm not sure that they would have had the time to do that in the 7 months that they went from Apollo 6 to Apollo 8 with their first manned launch.
Right.
Okay, Randy, then this is another but this is another question here that John has. He says, how much G-force would a rocket launch produce, and for how long? Is there a duration limit of G-force on the human body can sustain?
Sure.
You want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the equations in front of me in the math, but definitely, I mean, if there is a limit, I mean, we all know they do testing, G-force testing and astronauts, even test pilots, go through that. There is a limit where you pass out, and I'm not sure what that.
Around
I
seven
think,
G.
yeah, 7G, where you
Yeah, well,
pass
they
out.
were only pulling 3.5 to 4.
Yeah, yeah, but
So
still, that has an
that
effect.
wasn't a problem for them.
No, that
The
wasn't the problem, but still, it's a good question. It's a question that does need to be asked, because when you factor in other aspects of the F1 engines, which you just mentioned yourself, Scott, it does take a toll. So you have, as you said, you can't put a crew on board with that level of with that decibel level, right? And then you add in the G forces and other forces as well. So it's a lot. The human body's taking quite a pounding. So I give the viewer credit for asking that question.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting as well, though. Like when they're having that many problems with an engine, why would you put a human on board?
Yeah.
I mean, they did it very successfully. They got those rockets off the ground. The main, the 2 minutes and 42 seconds that these things had to burn at, right? But you could logically see, if you're not going to go anywhere, then you're not going to have the actual payload weight. And you can reduce the thrust, and you're going to get the same launch effect. And
So
you're
one thing is for
going to
sure.
bring down the risk. These
Yeah.
engines just produce this kind of sound. It doesn't matter what they were putting for thrust.
Yeah.
But to get down and take that pogo effect away, and people don't understand what that pogo effect is. That is a vibration, an oscillation that is vibrating at 180,000 times a second, just like a ultrasonic cleaner, right? But it's pulling 10 G's in each direction while it's doing it. Okay, it would literally, that pogo effect would liquefy your body.
Oh yeah. And you're right. I mean, there's an engineer who was involved in the Apollo program. There's a video online. I don't have the link right now, but there is a video, and he does specifically say what you just said. He went one step further. He said if there had been a crew on board at the launch of Apollo 6, they would have had to abort or be killed.
Once it started, it would just be over for them.
Yeah, they wouldn't have had time to abort, but that's what he was saying. Like he's trying to lessen the impact, but definitely, I mean, I'll tell you one thing. If that rocket had if they had lost an engine, it blew up on launch between launch pad and the 2 minutes and 40 seconds duration, they would not have been able, the escape tower would not have gotten them away in time. They would have been killed immediately, right? There was just no way that they could have launched the escape system on top of the command module. There's no way that would have, they wouldn't have been able to activate that quick enough. So they were taking a big chance. And there's one other point I want to make too with the F1 engines. Those engines would have to be working perfectly at full power in order to lift that 46-ton hardware into low Earth orbit, meaning the Apollo command module, the service module, and of course the lunar module, which is about 46, 47 tons. They would need that power of all the 7.5 million pounds of thrust, and it would have to work perfectly. If there was any kind of mishap and they're not going to make that 40-mile mark in 2 minutes, they would not be able to get into orbit. So it really raises my suspicions that if, as Robert said, and that they went into Apollo 11, that is, went into low Earth orbit, it really does raise my suspicions whether or not they were even using the F1 engines. And I might jump forward just a little bit to 1975 with the last launch of the Saturn V at Skylab. Skylab, of course, as we all know, was damaged. And I again, this is speculation, and a lot of what is going on with NASA is speculation. NASA speculates themselves, right? So it's okay for NASA to speculate, but not for us when we're questioning it. But speculation is a very big part of this. And I find that it's quite possible that they had a problem with the launch with Skylab when it was the last launch of the Saturn V. And it's quite possible it was due to the F1 engines. And that's probably why they ended. And it damaged Skylab when it got into orbit. They had to repair it, of course, and it came down several years later. But it's quite possible that that was it for them. They just said this is not going to work, so they eliminated the program. That's what I'm thinking is happening here.
Well, we're not
Well, the
saying
other
that
thing
they're
was
not
Charlie.
trying
Here's
to
what, yeah, but here, okay, but let's just go on now. So here's Jarl Bergen, or if it's Bergine, I don't know if there's two ways of pronouncing that, but did they fake the return by dropping the capsule from a cargo plane? A pilot and passengers allegedly saw the reentry. Well, I remember watching that where they were having champagne on the plane because the pilot came out, he saw this capsule coming out, the passengers claimed they'd seen it, and they broke out champagne because it was the Apollo 11 capsule coming back. So I don't understand how the pilot could see it if they're at 32,000 feet and this thing's coming down on shoots. I mean, do you realize that that plane would not have been able to get anywhere near that area? That would have been hundreds of miles off, at least 200 miles off limits from where that capsule was going to come down. So I don't believe that personally because of that. The military would have had planes out there and they would have been making certain that no one could have got within 200 miles radius of that capsule.
So why does
make
this plane
sense
happen to be within visual range, and why did it all of a sudden have a few cases of champagne to hand out? Right? Like, this, like, it was just all beautifully staged. If you look at the photographs of what was they so-called recovered on Splashdown, and Robert and I have looked at these, where the capsule connects to the service module, right? When it disconnects from there, and the piece that comes up for all the wiring and hardware and everything to run everything through there that has to disconnect on it. Take a look at the capsule. There's absolutely no marks where that thing disconnected from on that capsule. It's not there.
There's an interesting difference between the re-entry of the Russian, or as it was then, Soviet capsules and the American capsules. The Soviet capsules looked as if they had been almost burnt. The whole area was almost burnt when they landed. And the astronauts, I mean, this is coming back from low Earth orbit. We're not talking about deep space or anything because nobody's been there. From low Earth orbit, the Russians would land, usually on Earth. Obviously, it was in around Kazakhstan, northern Russia. And they were more or less unable to get out of the capsule themselves. And when they were taken out of the capsule, this is the Russians, they couldn't stand up. But Americans would sort of almost dance out of the capsule. When they got to the aircraft carrier, they were sort of going there to have their celebratory cakes and make speeches and behave as if nothing untoward had happened. There's a vast difference between the Soviet re-entry effects and the American re-entry effects. I mean, there are films of Russian cosmonauts being literally helped out of capsules, put onto day beds or sofa type things, chairs, before they can stand up. They recover quite soon, about 2 days. But when they come out of the capsule, they are very seriously affected by it. It's the microgravity. Now, to say that you're coming back from the International Space Station, you spent much longer in space than you would have if you were an Apollo astronaut. No, the two things are very similar. Space has serious effects on the human body.
Well, yeah, when you see the photographs, you look at the photographs of them coming out, even in Apollo 11, right? They just came out of hair and makeup on the studio set. I mean, their hair is beautifully bloody done, everything else. These guys should be covered in lunar dust, which is in some of the photographs, right?
Yeah.
But they come
Can I add
marching,
something?
they come marching in, and the cameras are there and everything is there. They've got absolutely perfectly their little flight suits. They've got those on. God only knows where their spacesuits ended up, right? When they come out of that capsule, right?
Yeah.
They get loaded
Well,
on board a ship back.
Can we just, I just want to ask you. So we have Chuck Shreve here. He says, what do you think about the legitimacy of the 1966 Lunar Orbiter 1 taking pictures of the moon?
Yeah. That's
Robert,
very,
can I go back to? Can I just respond to
Oh.
your previous question just for a second, and we'll
Oh, yeah.
we'll
What
go
was
with
that one? Sure. What was
Um,
that?
Yeah, that was when the passengers and the pilots
Oh,
of an
right.
aircraft.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah, I
put
just
that up.
want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just one point I want to make. Alice.com, of course, had written up some, posted some articles of this, and I read them very carefully. I actually wrote about it in my second book. And what's very interesting, I think it was actually pertaining to Apollo 8 and the Apollo 10 reentry, if I'm not mistaken. But what was very interesting about those two, the first one involved the military, US military, that was supposedly monitoring the reentry. And the second one involved, I think it was a Qantas Airlines DC-8, which involved the crew, of course, and the passengers. And what was very suspicious about that particular corridor of that Qantas DC-8, they were flying, all other areas were cordoned off for the supposed reentry of Apollo 10, but that particular airway was left open, which I find very suspicious. And it turns out that the captain of that flight was military, so that's a red flag right there. And he also gave a complete technical description to the passengers of what was happening. And the question is, how did he get that information so quickly? It just seemed like he had been prepared for this moment. And then when you look at the photos of the reentry, and interesting enough, there was a journalist on board who happened to have the right equipment to take a photo of the reentry of Apollo 10. And when you look at the photos very, very carefully, you zoom in on the details, you see not a reentry, but you see a very sort of linear thrust from what is obviously two jet engines. And they were simulating that. And to the previous question that the viewer sent in, yes, there was another plane, and I think it was regarding Apollo 11 this time, where he did witness the captain. And again, these are military. I believe he was military too, so it's another suspicious. But he did witness the pushing out of a C-130, pushing out an object and then falling to the ocean, exactly where the Apollo landing splashdown had taken place. So there was an elaborate ruse going on, and it involved unsuspecting airline passengers. But I think the captain and the co-pilot were probably briefed on what was going to happen. So I just wanted to get that in there because there is a lot of suspicions about how that actually happened too.
yeah, just one point. If we can go back to the question about the LRO pics taken in 1966.
Oh,
was
yes.
interesting.
You mean the one that I made on my computer in less than 2 minutes?
Well, that one as well. Yes, obviously that was, but that was allegedly the picture of the Apollo 11 landing site with all the necessary equipment there. There's a lot of information coming out now about these pictures, and we're told that the Chinese have photographed the Apollo sites, the Indians have photographed the Apollo sites. And well, where are the pictures? None of the Indian pictures have been publicly shown. The only picture that refers to the Indian craft photographing the Apollo site is that very, very strange image, which was a screen capture from a PowerPoint presentation. It wasn't an official picture released by the Indian Space Agency. It was somebody with a screen capture, and the image it showed was of a three-legged lander. Hang on a minute. Apollo had 4 legs. The only lander that had 3 legs was the Lunar surveyor, which was sent 66 to photograph the surface of the moon. It was the first time that anybody had successfully, no, the second time, the Russians had soft landed on the moon in February 66. Surveyor soft landed in June 66. And it took photographs of the lunar surface, which showed more or less what we expected to see. But these pictures from the Indian Space Agency allegedly showing the Apollo landing sites are ridiculous. They're not official Indian Space Organization photographs. They haven't been publicly released. They've been screen captured from a presentation given in India, and it shows a three-legged craft. Well, a three-legged craft would be the Surveyor craft. That had 3 legs. Apollo, guess what, has 4 legs. Oh, I hear you say, they're hidden by the shadows. No, they're not. All of them are perfectly possible to see. The Chinese have never released any photograph allegedly showing Apollo landing sites. They said they have seen evidence of Apollo on the moon. Well, there's plenty of evidence of Apollo on the moon. There's the rockets that, the stage 3 rocket that crashed onto the moon. That was the one that was recorded on the seismometers to show that the moon rang like a bell, which opened up all sorts of possibilities. You know, was the moon hollow? Was it artificial? Nobody's ever come any close to answering that one. So the idea that India and China have photographed Apollo landing sites is wrong, incorrect, doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and is only grasped at by those proponents of Apollo landings as some sort of satisfactory answer. It's not a satisfactory answer at all, especially when you look into it. And I've already, I mean, Jarrell White has written very extensively on this subject on the Owlist website. So let's just get it for real. Let's look at what the reality is and not what the hope is. The hope, as proposed by so many proponents, is that Apollo landed on the moon. That's what they want us to believe, because they believe it. Well, sorry, I don't believe it. I believe in 3 things: Father Christmas, the Tooth Fairy, and the Easter Bunny. For everything else, I want evidence. Where's the evidence? And this is the scientific method. That was a very good question previously. Where is the scientific method behind this? I think that we are producing some realistic answers, some scientific answers. And yes, I have studied physics. I did it to quite a high level at school. I do know a little bit about what I'm talking about. And science is not that difficult. It's not rocket science. That is difficult. Getting to the moon, that's difficult.
So, Marcus, Tinker the Terrible, she has a little question for you there. It says, for Marcus, not moon related, do you still think any of the talks and lectures on ancient technology? So do you still give any talks?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Ancient technology, ancient Egypt, the Barabar caves. Go and check those out. Barabar, Barabar caves, and Immanuel Velikovsky's work in the mid-1950s. The books that he wrote then. Some of them very interesting. And we still don't know how to build the pyramids, by the way. We're working on it. And maybe we'll get an answer one day. When we can
so then we have a question from Stephen Talon. He says, can you explain how the oxygen tanks held so much oxygen compared to deep sea divers? Cheers. Well, I would like to take a crack at that. Then maybe Scott or somebody else. But what I just don't understand is when you take a look at the PLSSs, it's a tiny little oxygen tank in there. I don't know how that could last for more than 15 minutes when you take a look at the size of the divers' tanks, and those last 20 minutes, 25 minutes. So I don't quite understand this. And another thing, why does pure oxygen poison divers if they use it in a pure form, but it doesn't do that to these astronauts? Now, I realize they're mixing gases in with it, but they sure didn't mix any gases with Apollo 1 when that fire broke out. That was pure oxygen. There was no nitrogen mixed in with that. And yet they were breathing it. So what's going on here? But anyone else want to take a crack at how this can happen, where these tiny little tanks can just last for 8 hours, 7.5, 8 hours on the moon? I mean, the diving business would be they would be elated to have this technology.
Here's the problem. Here's the problem with when you take a gas and you compress it. NASA was taking those tanks down to what, up to that little one in the OPS was had a gauge on it reading 5,500 psi. Well, the problem with when you take something like oxygen, when you start to compress it, when you get down, I think it's 780 psi or whatever, it turns to a liquid. Well, you can't compress a liquid. Why are you compressing it further? You can't get any more volume into that tank. And the only explanation that I saw that made any sense is when they're using that oxygen and you still have a half a tank left, it's still above that 780 psi, so it remains a liquid, which makes it more stable. Okay, and when you're adding oxygen, you're rebreathing the rest of the air within the spacesuit, and you're just adding a little bit of oxygen to it. You're not breathing 100% oxygen. It's not poisonous, right? You have a CO2 scrubber in there, and you're adding oxygen to it. And they claimed that they were keeping at it about 80% inside the suit, which is a little excessive. But that was so-called to make up for the lack of pressure. You're down to 3.7, 3.8 psi in the suit. The first documentation on the PLSS said that there was 3.5 hours of oxygen available on the thing. Without changing the PLSS, all of a sudden you're going out to 8 hours on the lunar surface. The tank didn't change in size. Nothing else inside that PLSS. It would have to be a hell of a lot bigger because you need bigger batteries. You're going to need a hell of a lot more water on there for your cooling system and everything else in there, right? And it's just going to need that much more power, that much more oxygen, everything else. Okay, but that's the same with every other piece of equipment. They went from 1 day stay to 3 day stay and nothing changed, right? And they added many tons of equipment. If you look at the difference between the LEM, between Apollo 11 and Apollo 15, right? To stay 3 days. Okay, they had 3 batteries on there for 1 day stay. So you have to add 6 more. Well, you're adding 1,800 pounds of equipment just in batteries alone to stay 3 days. Then you add the rover, its batteries, okay? And the EVAs, instead of 2 hours, are 24 hours total. So it's 10 times the amount of consumables that have to be added to that, right? Then, on top of that, you're depressurizing and repressurizing the LEM every time you get in and out. You have to account for that as a consumable as well, right? The amount of weight that they would have had to launch would have gone up dramatically. Now you look at today and you see what? They're going to be 14, 15 launches just to get enough fuel up there to go. I mean, the first calculations was 11 launches to low Earth orbit to put enough equipment in to land on the moon. That was in the early 60s. It was calculated you need 11 launches. All of a sudden they do it with 1 launch. I mean, this is where the problem is. This is where the only thing they're fueling is your imagination. Okay, they didn't have to fuel the rockets. They're fueling your imagination. And they built a rocket to excite your imagination.
Yes. Randy, do you have any thought on that? On the tanks, how they can be so small and yet last 8 hours, 7.5, 8 hours?
Well,
do you have any thought on that?
There still isn't enough in there.
Randy,
yeah. I can bottom line this. It works really well in movie studio.
Yeah. Okay. Well, another one here, Sean McHugh says, hope you can emphasize more about the unscientific nature of Apollo record as lacking sufficient verification or reproducibility, the essence of the scientific method. Well, maybe did we kind of cover that, or because they can't reproduce it?
It's worth emphasizing, I think, that the scientific method is what is the basis of all engineering, of all science. You've got to be able to reproduce it. You've got to have the evidence. You can then, if anybody can then follow that report and reproduce what is being proposed, that is the scientific method. And it's noticeable, just as an aside, that in the last few weeks, I think it was Nature magazine, one of the world's foremost scientific publications, has had to withdraw 10,000 papers that were originally published, having been peer reviewed, as being rubbish, nonsense, unreproducible. That is the problem that science has right now. It needs to look at itself, it needs to look at what it's doing, and stop being political and start being scientific. Apollo was basically a political event. It wasn't a scientific event, which is why NASA are so keen to prevent anybody exposing what they're doing. Unfortunately, with the internet and with the books that have been published, I mean, Randy's published 3 books. Trevor Weaver has published 4 books. There have been probably 20 books published in the last 25 years disputing the Apollo lunar landings. Are all these people complete fools, fruitcakes, and non-scientific authors? No. They're people who spent a lot of time, effort, and work looking into the science behind Apollo, and they have found it universally lacking. I mean, Robert, you've probably seen a lot of the attacks that Randy's had to deal with.
Oh, have I seen them? I've had to remove a lot of them.
Because
that's on my channel. Randy had to do a lot of cleanup on his own channel.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these things happen. Just to comment on a couple of points that have already been raised. Solar Warden asked about Maurice Chatelain as reporting that the Apollo astronauts had seen craft watching them. I mean, that's a fairly common story. I don't think it was purely Maurice Chatelain who made that point.
No, you know what, Marcus? That was a hoax. That the whole thing was a hoax. That's what it was. Because when they looked in his personal diary, that was never found. So it was a hoax. And I remember where it started from. As I was asking around this started apparently from Neil Armstrong being at a party, and he was talking to somebody, and this woman overheard him talk about this craft that's watching us on the surface. That's where this whole urban legend started from. Yeah. But anyways, sorry interrupting. Go ahead. What you were saying.
No, I mean, the idea that they could have seen anything on the lunar surface is very good ammunition for people who want to say, well, they got there to see it. And that's all it comes down to. It's just confirmation bias. And in the same way that we've got the LRO pictures, they were for real. Those LRO pictures taken in 1966, they were for real. It was the way they were transmitted back to Earth that was interesting. Because don't forget that Edwin Land, he of the Polaroid camera and photographic system, was a consultant to NASA at the time as to how they could transmit the pictures back to Earth. So those pictures are for real. Some of the early ones are very detailed, much more so almost than the lunar orbiter stuff, which is complete nonsense. If it was so good using 21st century technology, when you can photograph your car sitting outside your house from a satellite orbiting 400 miles above the Earth's surface, why can't you photograph what's on the moon from 15 miles, 15 miles above the lunar surface, which is what we're told the lunar reconnaissance orbiter was flying at? It doesn't make sense. Hence, the scientific method, when it's applied, demonstrates that NASA produces never a straight answer.
No, and you know what, Marcus? Here's a good question from this Korat. Now, we all know who he is. He's one of Gorell's supporters. And I said, well, listen, you can come up and ask questions. I'll put it up. But he says, can you explain more about how the space shuttle can come back to Earth with no issue, but the Apollo capsule, I'm supposing what he's saying here, Coming back to the Earth is not possible.
Yeah, straightforward. The space shuttle.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, the space shuttle coming back from the ISS or low Earth orbit is
But it's not doing 25,000 miles per hour either, is it?
no 17 and a half
exactly.
thousand. So when you're coming back from the moon, the orbit speed is twice that. Well, the energy required to be dissipated is twice that required to be dissipated by the space shuttle. It's not rocket science, this. It's just mathematics. So an Apollo spacecraft coming back from lunar orbit at 25,000 miles an hour, because it's being attracted to the Earth by the Earth's gravity. It doesn't need to use rocket fuel to get back from the moon. It just uses rocket fuel to get out of lunar orbit. All the way back to Earth, it's being attracted by gravity. It's a free ride, but it's got to the Earth at 25,000 miles an hour. Now it's got to slow down. That's the problem. And we've seen it on the Artemis mission that the heat shield on the Orion spacecraft, Apollo 2.0, was seriously damaged. And that would be unacceptable to have humans on board, which is why there's so much delay.
And now we have one here from I guess, Joe Vans. India confirmed the Apollo 11 and 12 missions with pictures from the Chandrayaan-2 mission. Why would India do that? Can you guys talk about that for a bit?
Yeah.
Chandrayaan-2.
In fact, we've already covered that. They haven't produced the pictures. They haven't. The Indian Space Organization have not produced the pictures allegedly taken of the Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 missions. They haven't done it. They've said that they may have seen some Apollo material on the lunar surface. That's completely different from producing a picture showing the lander. They haven't done it. That answer your question, Jeep? I hope so. And anyway, India and China and Japan use NASA tracking technology to help locate the craft. So they're beholden to NASA. And because they want to develop their own space programs, India, China, Japan, and probably Nigeria coming up quite soon, probably Britain when it gets its act together, that'll be a day, will want to use NASA's tracking technology. NASA have 3 major tracking stations, one near Madrid, one near Goldstone in California, and one near Canberra in Australia. And in order to use them, they may be owned by the Australian governments, the Spanish governments, and the American governments, but NASA provide the technology. So they're beholden to NASA. And they're not going to come around and say, oh, you didn't land on the moon, you guys. Guess what? They might not be allowed to use their equipment anymore. Even the Russians used the British Jodrell Bank tracking station to follow the Lunar 15 going to the moon at the same time as Apollo 11. NASA knew what was going on. Fortunately, they didn't hit. How was the hypergolic fuel regulated on the LEM? That should be LM, not LEM, but never mind. When it came to make minute corrections to dock with the command module. Well, it's fairly easy to regulate it if you've got the right equipment and you know how much power you need to produce. Whether they did it or not, maybe the scientific examination of the...
Actually, the service module did all the docking controls.
Okay.
When the LEM, like if you call it the LEM, it's the Lunar Excursion module. That's what it was originally called, and they shorten it to just the LM, right?
Yeah.
Lunar module. The guidance system is being controlled by the orbiter, not the LEM when it's taking off. Those little retro rockets and everything else, when it was taking off, that engine fires at full throttle for a little over 7 minutes. Finishes, it's supposed to hit 60 miles at 6,000 miles an hour, and the little retros it had on there was just to guide it on the way up.
Yeah.
Once it got into orbit, then the service module was to take over and do the docking procedure.
And now there's another one, Adam Sekula. Apollo 17 Station 2 and 4, view of the Earth. How do you comment, gentlemen?
Very simple.
I don't quite understand.
Yeah. Well, they say they had a view of Earth. We've seen the pictures. That wonderfully composed image on Apollo 17 of the astronaut, I think it was Jack Schmitt, and the American flag pointing at the Earth. That's a wonderful image. But the Earth was added to the picture later. If you do the examination of it, you'll see it. Very simple.
And by the way, I have downloaded the TIFFs, the raw files, and when I put it in my editor, here's something too about editors and software that I want to bring up that Mr. McToon failed to bring up. Because when you use Photoshop, if you use VideoPad Editor, if you use Shotcut, if you use Adobe After Effects, or if you use Wondershare Filmora, I use all of them. Yeah. And every time I put a photo into one of those pieces of software, the default level for the brightness, contrast, and all the other settings are not the same. So I can open those 5 sets of software up. I can put the same picture, the TIFF, into it, and the brightnesses default levels are going to be different in each one of them. Some are brighter, some are less, some are more color, some are vibrant, some are darker, some are lighter. It all depends. So whatever McToon was saying about, oh, these TIFFs are darker and this and that, well, they are darker. But it depends what software you're using. And it also depends what version of Photoshop you're using, because the default settings are not 100% the same either.
Yeah.
And then we have Christopher A.D. He says, is the leaf shutter in the Hasselblad camera under pressure? If not, would it not cold weld in the vacuum on the moon? What about the shutter button? Same problem. Well, I've shown those leaf shutters many times on the channel. And if they are not coated with that material, they will cold weld together.
Even the coating will cold
the ones
weld.
I've shown.
I'd like to respond to
don't
Adam
really
here, Robert, about the Apollo 17, about the Earth view that he was showing there, because I know those images quite well. First of all, in those 2 photographs that he's talking about, the Earth is far too low in the sky. Number one of those photographs, and this is Apollo 17, is absolutely flat. There's no mountains in the background anywhere. And that's not possible.
Yeah. Good point.
Those are the 2 comments I'd like to make about what he was talking about, the view of the Earth. First of all, the Earth is smaller than what we see the moon in those photographs, but it's less than 20 degrees in the sky. It should be about at least 80 degrees in the sky from the location of the Apollo 17, if you're looking at the Earth.
Which is why it was all a political event. They had to show.
It's just pasted in however they inserted the Earth view from those things. But the one is absolutely ridiculous because there are no mountains anywhere in the scene. It's just perfectly flat.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they could make a mistake like that.
Because they hadn't thought it through. They were so desperate to get the 5,771 photographs allegedly taken on the lunar surface into the record. And we only saw all of those pictures when the internet was able to upload them. And that was about the year 2002.
They had it ready it was the University of Indiana that put on the 30th anniversary of Apollo. So they started. Okay,
that was 1999.
Kip Teague was hired because of his computer expertise at the time, to be able to scan the photographs in. So 1996 up to there, because he had to have them by 1999.
Yeah,
Okay,
1999.
he had that's it, and the University of Indiana put on the 30th anniversary of Apollo.
So that was
So
the
that
first.
website was created and uploaded there, and what they call a large file or high resolution file was 1.1 megabyte, which was incredible to put through on a computer to scan that.
Yeah. Try downloading a 1.1 megabyte file on a dial-up connection, which is basically all we had at that time.
That's right.
It was only when broadbands became more easily obtainable that we could see them in reality. So it was over 30 years before many of the photographs were even viewed.
Yeah,
And
you
now,
imagine the work he had to do to upload that to a website with the technology they had available, even if they had, a T1 line coming in the building. Okay, it's going to be a hell of a thing to put up 5,700, photographs on the thing, as well as develop
Yes,
that
well,
website,
you know what?
the journal site, right?
Yeah, okay. We have another question here from the third rail. Are you guys aware of the swinging bag on the Mesa table footage? Well, I'll tell you something. I do remember that, and I went over this 6 years ago with Brian Pop Robson, and I did the same thing with him that I did with McToon. What I did was I take the footage of that bag, okay, and I put that into my editor. And what I do is I convert that to 24 frames per second. You have to be on the same playing field here. So whatever the footage was before, you have to bring all the footage to 24 frames or 28. It doesn't matter. It has to be the same when you're putting it in the editor. And then what I did was I dropped frames, added frames, dropped frames until I got that bag swinging exactly as it was in that footage on the moon. Now, you have variable frame rate, you've got constant frame rate, you have variable frame rate, you've got constant variable frame rate. So you use a lot of choices that you have to pick here. But in any case, I did get the bag to swing just as it did on the moon, as it should have on the Earth. So that should answer that question.
Yep, it does. It's called special effects. Hollywood is very good at it. They've been doing it for years.
And then we have Korat here. He says, for my research, the VABs are donut-shaped and is not as strong at the poles. Could a rocket be launched from the poles to avoid the VAB radiation? Randy, you want to take that one?
Yeah, good question. But I want to go back a bit to something that Marcus said earlier, if I can first. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Marcus,
go for it.
No, I just wanted to expand on when Marcus was talking about the scientific method. And one of the problems I find, the scientific method in theory is not being followed. It's not being followed with the Apollo moon missions. It's not being followed in many other aspects of society, which is why science itself is breaking down, because they haven't been following their own rules, and which is creating such a distrust. But one of the points I'd like to add to what Marcus was saying is peer reviewed. And I often hear this when it comes to the moon rocks, and other aspects of the Apollo missions. It was peer reviewed. But you know what? This peer reviewed is absolute nonsense. I'm not talking about the real peer review. I'm talking about their version of peer review papers. There was a recent poll that came out, and I don't have a source of that poll right now. I'll try to look for it later, but it came up online. And the majority of scientists in that poll said that when they're peer reviewing a paper, they're heavily influenced by the funding they're getting. So given the fact that this peer-reviewed process is done by scientists who are funded by, universities, corporations, and directly government funding, then they're influenced by that source of funding. So it's now political. It's not peer review anymore, and it's not science, it's political. And we've seen an abundance of that happen in the last 4 years. One other point I want to make before I get to this person's question is somebody mentioned earlier, and I thought it was a really good point. He mentioned the electric universe. And he even admitted in his questions a bit off topic, but it's actually part and parcel to the whole thing, because the electric universe is a very viable theory, in my opinion. And it really goes against Einstein's theory of Einstein's relativity theory. And I don't want to get into that aspect of it, but that also impacts the Apollo missions and anything that has to do with sending manned missions back and forth from the moon. So, the physics may not be what we've been told. And so I just wanted to make that, it was an interesting point, the electrical universe, and that gets into quantum theory and everything. Is quantum theory really, does it really exist? And Einstein seemed to have had a problem with that. So I just want to put that out there. Now, this question, the previous question, is it easier to go through the poles? Was that the question he was asking?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So my answer to that is, well, I don't know if it's easier in so much as in terms of avoiding radiation. Well, not Vernon von Braun, Dr. Van Allen himself said that it would be more practical. I don't think he said it was easier. It'd be more practical to send manned missions through the poles, the South Pole and the North Pole, because of less intense radiation. But you have to go really far. I mean, you'd have to go, I'm just guessing now, 20, 30, 40,000 miles if you launch from the north to get around the VAB. So you're talking about a lot more propellant, a lot more resources involved. So is it safer? Maybe. Is it practical? No.
I think the other thing is you find that the poles, when you get to the poles, I mean, you have the aurora borealis sitting there, right? And the reason for that is because the radiation, it's more concentrated. You have that bow shock effect, and it's pushing around. The radiation is actually quite concentrated if you're going out there, even though it's not
that all year round
within the belt.
Is that all year
still
round?
in the bow shock.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
you see that any of the diagrams, if people look at it and say, oh, well, there's a hole there. There's not a hole. That bow shock wraps right around the Earth. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's actually more concentrated at the poles. It's being compressed as it's doing that.
And of
Okay.
course,
Okay, I got a question for you though. Is that constant, or is there a way to monitor that? See, this is another.
That's constant.
That's constant. See, but this gets into something else that we're constantly talking about when it comes to the Van Allen belts. Is there's never any real-time monitoring of these belts when they're sending manned missions through. I'm talking about 50 years ago. There was never any real-time data.
No.
The data was taken from satellites positioned outside, but they never had real-time data. And given that the Van Allen belts are in constant flux, and we get slammed for saying in flux, right? That's very interesting too. So that tells me we're right. Van Allen, Dr. James Van Allen himself said it would be safer to go through the poles. So maybe he missed your point. I don't know, but that's just
It's a shorter distance, but he didn't know. He knew the belts were there. He knew the shape of the belts. He had a pretty good idea of the shape of the belts, but he didn't know about the bow shock.
Yeah. Well, I think the point is, though, Scott, the point I'm trying to make is that he was advocating through the poles, irrespective of whether it's safe or not. At the time, he may not have known. My point is that he wasn't advocating he wasn't endorsing sending manned missions through the Van Allen belts. That's really my point. So you're right. I'm assuming you're right about the North and South poles, but his point at the time, he didn't know about that, but he was relaying a message about how dangerous it was to go through the Van Allen belts. So that's kind of what my point is.
Yeah, the whole point going through the belts is the actual concentration. The actual concentration of the belts, okay, is sitting there. It's taking radiation from space, and it's bending it. It's actually the magnetic lines, the electromagnetic lines, if you like, of the belts, okay, redirect the cosmic radiation that's coming in. And it somewhat increases a little bit because it packs up over a 25,000 mile range of the belts, the width of the belts, right? And it redirects it around the Earth. That's protecting it. That's what's protecting the Earth. But that constant radiation coming in from the sun, and if you look at what is happening today, we are on the amount of solar flares happening every day, and it's going to increase, and they claim it's going to hit a peak in July of 2025, the solar flares right now. You go online and look at what's happening with the solar flares. They have all of this stuff. The thing is, there's so many flares that the belts actually strengthen. Okay? The belts actually strengthen from the impact from the sun. Okay? And you actually get a higher magnetic force. Like your compass is going to work a whole lot better because you have a higher force happening from them, right? That's what's protecting the Earth, right? But that stuff is coming in there. People don't understand. They think, oh, you go through the belts and then there's no radiation. No, it's incredible radiation.
Yeah, all the way to the moon.
Okay, it just bends around the Earth as the Earth's traveling through space. You get that bow shock around there. And the solar flares increase it a little bit. When you get the increase, it rolls around, concentrates at the poles, and that's where you get the northern lights and the southern lights from, right?
Well, I think the whole point is that this is an evolving science, and it's evolving every day. And when you were talking about that, there was also back in 2012 when NASA discovered by accident a third naturally formed radiation belt that dissipated, I guess, over several months. But nonetheless, they found that there was a third belt that had formed. And so they speculated. See, it's okay for NASA to speculate, but not us, you know. But NASA speculated that that third belt was formed from a solar event. Whatever that solar event was. Well, that's very interesting because back in August 4th of 1972, before the last mission of Apollo 17, there was a major event that caught NASA off guard. It's reasonable to assume that and this happened in August, so what, 3 or 4 months later, they sent up Apollo 17. It's reasonable to assume that there was a third belt formed for that during that time period. And which meant that the astronauts would have been in intense radiation even longer than NASA had told us. So, you know, there's a lot of speculation on both sides, and NASA does a lot of that themselves. So that's something that proponents would never be able to really counter because they had no real-time data back then. When they were supposedly sending up the Apollo missions. So it's reasonable to assume that there was now a third belt. And don't forget that they had exploded a thermonuclear device in 1962, and that formed an artificial radiation belt. So now you have four radiation belts at that time when Apollo 17 was going up. So, you know, I'm just putting that out there, folks.
We are fairly arrogant to think we could, you know, explode a nuclear weapon in space and punch a hole in the belts so you could travel through it.
Yep. No, we have Anthony Norris here. He has a question. The Russians flew missions around to the moon with turtles and fruit flies, I believe. Did the Americans fly any missions around to the moon with animals before sending humans? Not that I'm aware of.
No, they didn't. Those turtles and fruit flies were flown by the Russians, which is a sensible test to take to see what would happen. But the Russians, being good chess players, they decided to play a bit of a trick on America at that time. Those fruit flies and turtles were launched, I think it was Lunar 11, something like that. No, Zond 5. And they were launched in September 1968, before Apollo 8 took off in December 1968. And one of the things they did, say they were good chess players, Russians, they put a tape recorder on board as well. And when they got to the moon, they switched the tape recorder on, and a voice was heard saying, Oh, I can almost touch those craters. Aren't they lovely? How close we are to the moon. Now, that implied that there was a human on board as well. There wasn't. It was a tape recorder. But it spooked America so much that they brought forward the launch of Apollo 8 with humans on board, which had never been tested. The heat shield on Apollo 8 had never been tested. It was a terrible risk to take, assuming it even happened. And they didn't just go into low Earth orbit, as we know every other Apollo mission did, because they were so spooked by the Russians. And when Bowman visited the Soviet Union fairly soon after that, he was accused of being he accused the Russians of being space hooligans because they'd fooled them so much, which almost implied that it was for real, that the Russians had got to the moon with a craft, unmanned as it happened. They were very good at space navigation. So you've got this dichotomy between what America say happened, what Russia actually did complete, and the stories that NASA now keep coming out with.
Yeah.
And there was a previous question about, I think it was James Webb, who was the administrator of NASA from 1961 through to 1968, and he allegedly resigned. I suspect he was fired because he was not willing to encounter or to encourage humans onto the moon until they had ensured that they could return them. That's why the Russians never did it. The Soviets couldn't ensure the safe return of humans due to the dangers of radiation. And they made the reasonable assumption that America knew the same. So what on earth were they doing sending humans to the moon in December 1968 on Apollo 8 without testing it? Made no sense to the Russians, which is why they knew that America were faking it, but they weren't going to call them out for various political reasons to do with natural gas and supply of grain over many years. But that's another story. So, yeah. And anyway, just to look at the point about going through the poles to avoid the radiation, what Scott has said is quite right. The radiation is everywhere. And anyway, if you're going to launch a rocket to go into polar orbit, you don't launch it from Florida, you launch it from California. That's where all the spy satellites are launched that go into polar orbits. When you launch from Florida, you're flying out across Africa, India, and back around that way, equatorial orbits. So the idea of launching through the poles, you're not going anywhere near the moon if that's the case. You've got to then change direction, which you can't do very easily because you need a lot of fuel to change direction in space. It makes no sense that they would do it that way. And I think what Randy said about James Van Allen is quite right. He didn't necessarily know all that we know today about radiation in space. So
No, and then we have
sorry.
we have another question here from Maroon Thorson. If the moon landings were a media stunt, then how many people would have had to known about it? Realistic bid, please, equals not every astronaut ever. So I guess the question is if the moon landings were a media stunt, then how many people would have to know about it? Not many, would they?
Well, not many, actually. Very few. Probably about 50, I would say. The senior personnel at NASA would know about it. Astronauts would have had to know about it. And possibly the people creating the filming. And if anybody wants to know how it was done, check out Make Believe Smoke and Mirrors. Now, Make Believe Smoke and Mirrors is a 2-hour, 44-minute film. It's available on the Apollo Detectives website, where Robert has put a very, very good new commentary on it, so you can hear what is being said. It's created about 10 years ago by an anonymous creator. He wanted to remain anonymous, which is why you couldn't actually hear what he was saying most of the time. Now Robert has created the commentary so that you can understand it. It's a very technical subject. There would have been people probably at Lookout Mountain Laboratories in Laurel Canyon, north of Los Angeles, who would have known about it. But they would have all signed oaths of secrecy non-disclosure agreements, everything we know about today, they were honorable men. They were doing the best job they could for their country. That's what honorable people do. They're patriots. They do it the way they consider to be appropriate at the time. If keeping secrets, then that's what people do. They keep secrets. It's not hard to keep secrets. As I think I described it on the McToon show or something like that. Anyway, when the designer of the camera system on the Hexagon spy satellite, that's KH-9, was working on the development of these camera systems using photographic film, this stuff, photographic film, if anybody can remember what it looks like, that's photographic film. His wife knew nothing about the work he was doing because he had been required to keep it secret. He was working under security conditions and he kept it secret. And I actually spoke to his wife. She said, no, I knew nothing about what he was doing. I didn't need to know. I knew he was enjoying his work. That's all I needed to be aware of. So people can keep secrets, but in terms of the numbers, it's probably 50. That's the figure I consider appropriate.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add too, Marcus, and I'm sure you would agree, when it comes to, and you've talked a lot about this compartmentalization, and even if it was more than 50, some people say it's up to 100, and there's bound to be leaks. And this is the next question. I can sense it coming. Is then why didn't anybody speak? Well, first of all, in the last 50 years, the mainstream media has been very powerful and very good at controlling the narrative. And a whistleblower would never be allowed to make an appearance on CNN. And let me ask a counter question to the proponents out there. Do you really believe for 1 second that any whistleblower was going to get his day on CNN? And the answer is no. So that was another way to block the, because I sense he's kind of getting at that aspect of it. That's another way to block the information from coming out. Sure, you'll hear about it on alternative media like Rumble, BitChute, somewhat on YouTube, but that censorship is very powerful, and the mainstream media has been very, very good at that. So even if more people knew and that information got out, it would be shut down pretty quickly because, let's face it, up to about 4 or 5 years ago, most people were relying on CNN and Fox News for their information. So if it's not on there, it doesn't exist.
Good point. Well said. And then we have the dear old BBC over here in the UK who follow along doing the same thing. And they have their international news channel as well. And they're getting called out over in the UK about many, many things.
They are, yes, I noticed that.
So there's quite a lot of pushback against it. And as you mentioned, there are channels people can go onto and get unbiased and uncensored information and decide for themselves. That's the scientific method. Yeah. You have to be able to confirm it for yourself. You don't take what somebody else says. If you want to believe it, that's fine. You can believe anything you like. But it doesn't necessarily mean to say it's the truth. I mean, we've discussed how some of these scientific papers, and I prefer to use the term PAL-reviewed, not peer-reviewed. Peers would imply that they are of equal knowledge and standing to the people whose scientific papers are being reviewed. They're
you mean PAL as in pay a lot?
Pay a lot. Oh, that's good. I like that. Pay a lot. Nice one. And here we have an interesting question. The third rail. Did the astronauts ever speak about the gravity on the moon when they got to the moon? I have never heard this. Only when they got back did they talk about it. That's quite true. I never heard anybody discussing gravity. I never even saw pictures of them demonstrating the less gravity on the moon there is on Earth.
Well, they kind of did when they were trying to do that javelin throw, and when he tossed the bag, and when they did the golf shot.
Yeah. Okay.
All that was about gravity on the moon. That's what they were talking about. No atmosphere.
But I like the way you phrased that. Kind of did.
Kind of did, but no, they
Kinda
didn't discuss. They didn't discuss how their body was reacting to a reduced gravity.
No.
Okay, not even when they were doing the jump salute.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean that's like people need to know that there's so much missing in the transcript that should have been there.
Yeah.
Just so much stuff that is missing. I mean, you realize somebody had to write the script. Okay, and they couldn't possibly have thought of everything that needed to be. Even if you were reenacting it, you can't think of all of the things that should be happening while you're doing that. I mean, the biggest error that they had is they simply forgot about the guy orbiting for all 6 inches. There's no way you're not going to talk to the guy that's orbiting for 3 days. You know,
Yeah.
like
A lot of their training. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but I mean, they're on a movie set. So they have the 2 actors on board. They need to get these photographs in. That's the most important thing that they need to do. They need to get the film camera running and everything else on the set and shoot the 2 guys on the surface. The entire transcript is written and every second is accounted for. And you can't have a guy that's orbiting once an hour. He's available to talk to for 22 minutes out of an hour if they were actually on the moon. He's going to check in with them and say, what's happening down there? Are you still alive? You know, do we need to cut it short? You know, do you need to get back on board? Right? That's what the guy that's orbiting, because he's like 22 minutes out of an hour. The rest of the time, he doesn't know what's going on. He's out of communication, right? The guys on the lunar surface are going to want to know if he's still alive up there, if something happened to him, right? Because otherwise, they're on the lunar surface. They're going to die there, right? If they can't get back up, if there's nothing up there. These things are all missing in the transcript. And there's so many little technical details. You see them setting up equipment. Those are just movie props sitting there. Okay? Do you see them testing it? Do you see them talking to Houston about any of this equipment that they set up? This is the stuff they're going to leave there and have for years to come, the information coming back. And they haven't tested any of it. Okay? They just throw it on the ground while you actually see them tripping over it and everything else. They're breaking it. You name it, snapping the cables and everything else on it. That's what you see. But you don't see them sitting there talking to Houston saying, have you got a signal back from this thing?
Yeah.
Right? They didn't check it to see if it's powered up.
Well, then we have this too, Scott. Then we have another question too, like Intel debrief. A scuba diver has access to dials and gauges used to monitor life support. Did the astronauts have any of this?
Yeah, they're on the front of their equipment that they can't see with the visor, and the other ones are up on top of the OPS pack. The only gauge they had was the one on the wrist for the pressure of the suit. Everything else they couldn't see. They'd have to have, the other guy would have to look at their gauges. Okay, because they physically can't see them.
And also, don't forget that if they were allegedly on the moon, well, if they're allegedly on the moon, they had to put on all these life support systems within the lunar module, which was the size of a large car, 160 cubic feet of space. Now, I don't know how many people have tried putting on diving suits and backpacks inside a car and then checking them, because if you get it wrong, you're dead. So you had to be sure that you were in the suits properly and that the equipment worked properly. But we don't, as Scott said, you don't see any of this in the transcripts. There's no checking.
I want to check the suit before I depressurize the capsule.
Yeah. And it would take a while to depressurize it anyway. But the idea
wouldn't take that long. Wouldn't take that long to let the pressure down to test the suit, really.
But if they're
more to repressurize it than it would to bring it down.
Yeah.
But it's not even in the transcript. They just skipped that.
Yeah. because they didn't think it was important or somebody hadn't remembered to do it.
Well, when you consider there was no console in that prop that they were using.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no console there. Buzz Aldrin comes out the door. There's no console there whatsoever. All they needed was that door frame and the ladder down, because that's where the camera was.
Yeah, I think we've demonstrated that quite conclusively.
Okay, and the whole thing is about all of the equipment to record it as a historic event, so that they can claim that they won the space race. They're the greatest country in the world, right? And put an end to the Cold War.
That's what it was all about.
Here's another question. Yeah, there's one from Anthony Norris. When the astronauts picked up rocks from the moon, did they weigh the rocks before they came back? To get the trajectory correct, they needed to know the weight for re-entry. Any thoughts on that?
Not to my recollection. I may be wrong, but I don't recall anything in the narrative that they were weighing the rocks. I think there's some documentation on that easily could have been done after the fact, but that's an interesting question, because the previous question to this actually ties in with this, and here it is: skip reentry. So I've written about the Apollo guidance computer, and what if that amount of weight that they're putting in turn, and it varied for all these 6 missions. So it was like 75 pounds versus like 150 pounds. But overall, the average weight was about the size of a human being, about 145, 150 pounds. That's average. I'm not talking specifically for each mission. But what if they miscalculated? Weight and balance would really be a factor when they enter the Earth's atmosphere, because that's when it becomes prominent. So if they're off, could the Apollo guidance computer have the ability to adjust by firing thrusters? I don't think so, no, because the Apollo guidance computer required human interface, right, for directives. So that's a very good question. And I just want to make one point about the skip entry. There seems to be some discrepancy whether it was skip reentry or direct entry. Now, the official version, and coming back from the moon, they would use the method of skip reentry, but the astronauts themselves weren't very clear. There's been, and I documented this in book 2, that they would let it slip out, oh, it was direct entry, or no, it was skip entry. So they weren't in agreement on that after the fact either. So I just thought that was an interesting point.
Yeah, stars or no stars again, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But skip re-entry is what the Soviets did.
Yeah.
The Russians never did it. They've never said they did it. They never described it. And doing direct entry, you've got to be very, very accurate. You have about a 20-mile wide window through which the capsule must enter. If it goes too high, it bounces off the atmosphere and goes into orbit around the sun forever. If it comes in too low, it burns up because it's going too fast into a relatively small amount of atmosphere. There's only 60 miles of atmosphere above Earth, up to the Kármán line. Well, it's actually 50 miles, but they describe it as 60 miles because 100 kilometers, which was what Theodore von Kármán decided would be a better level, because everybody would understand 100 kilometers. It's a very, very small window. And I've tried to describe it by saying it's like someone standing on top of the Empire State Building with a marble, and me standing at the bottom of the Empire State Building and catching that marble in a beer mug, 3 inches in diameter, 6 times on the trot. How likely is that? It's very unlikely that they would get it right every time through this 20-mile wide corridor, through which they would then enter the atmosphere, remove the heat, the kinetic energy of the re-entering spacecraft. Hence, they had to have the heat shield. And then we have the problem of what happens to the holes in the heat shield that joined the command module above the service module. They were attached together. On re-entry, the command module was separated from the service module, but it left holes in the heat shield, which had to be filled in with little pads. Now, if one of those pads, and there would be 6 of them on Orion, 4 of them on Apollo, if one of those pads did not seat correctly, you would have a very similar result to the Columbia space shuttle reentry. It would burn up. Astronauts would not survive it.
And Orion demonstrated that, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. It definitely demonstrated it. So these are all the questions, which are quite reasonable questions to ask. And I think the idea that we're not using the scientific method, Sean McHugh made a very good question about it. If we're not using the scientific method, we're in the realm of fantasy.
Yeah.
Which we've been all along. Apollo was a political event. It wasn't a scientific event. And it had to be seen to succeed so that America could demonstrate its superiority over the Soviet Union. In that, it succeeded. But it wasn't real. It was fantasy. And now we're beginning to discover how fantastic it was.
Now I'm just looking at Falcon here. Because how long do you guys think that they will delay manned moon or Mars missions because of the missing know-how? Or do you think that they will fake it once more to make it all that difficult to make questions go away?
I like that.
Well, again, I really don't think that they're going to fake it now. They can't. Well, everybody's on to them now. I mean, listen, when these guys go, when they finally sent Artemis 3, I was thinking of renting the Kecksburg telescope. So that, and then, no, seriously, and then having a live and showing that telescope while we are sitting here controlling it. And then we will be able to watch that craft as it travels to the moon. I mean, there's just too many obstacles in the way. These guys, they can't fake it anymore. They can't even get Artemis 2 off the ground. They need a gateway station, which is going to be completely pummeled by little tiny meteorites. Yeah, I mean, this is fitted. There's no Van Allen belts. There's no belts. There's no protection around that moon. Look at how many rocks come into the Earth. I mean, the Earth's pummeled by them. They're all over. You could find them all over the place. Why do you think von Braun went to Antarctica with that team? You know, so they could pick up rocks, because that's where they're going to fall.
Yeah.
You know, so no, I really don't think that's going to happen. It's too, they can't get away with it anymore. People are waking up and smartening up. That's what I would say.
Which is also why the spacesuit problem has risen again. The company has decided they're not going to build spacesuits anymore, and that gives NASA a wonderful opportunity to delay it yet again. I mean, the Artemis program, as we know today, started life back in 2004.
Yeah.
It became the Constellation program, then it became the Artemis program. And that's over 20 years. They haven't got off the ground properly. And that one launch of the Artemis mission, it was in December last year. It was unmanned. It carried 2 space crash dummies, Helga and Zohar, to record the radiation readings that would be encountered. Well, where's the evidence for that? Maybe NASA have decided that, yeah, it would be too dangerous for humans. That's what they said about 20 years ago. Radiation is a major problem in space for humans, not for equipment, not for unmanned satellites. They can be protected against it. It's called hardening. But the idea that humans can go into space is fantasy. There's no way we can go into space and survive and get back alive. So no,
it's interesting. Sorry, I thought you were finished.
Yeah, that's okay.
Oh, no, I want you to finish your point.
No, I finished actually.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, great. Just to elaborate, Marcus, on what you're saying, there's 2 Netflix programs that involve half the scenes on the International Space Station, and you can't tell the difference between those scenes and the real ISS. It's impossible to tell the difference. And of course, people will jump on me and say, "Oh, Randy saw a Netflix program, so he's making his determination for that." That's not my point. My point is that the special effects that they have now would make it virtually impossible for them to actually fake it, because as both Marcus and Robert, as you said yourself, people are onto them. But it makes me think back 50 years ago to the Apollo missions, that people are arguing they didn't have that photographic and film technology. But the point that I keep bringing up, and I think all of you will agree, is that the military, whether you want to hear this or not, the military was in full control. Most of the personnel that were involved in the Apollo missions were military men. They were in full control, and and they had full access to military classified photographic and film equipment. And the military back then, I don't know if that applies now, but I know back then had the largest film studios in the world, even studios that surpassed Hollywood. So that has to be factored in. You can't just, nobody can make a blanket statement and say, oh, they didn't have that technology, because military technology is usually 20, 30 years ahead of what we know about today. So, and we see evidence of that coming out in terms of new fighter equipment, fighter jets, so on and so forth. Well, we've had hints 20 years ago that they exist, and then they come out and they admit it. So it was the same thing with Area 51. For the longest time, the CIA refused to acknowledge it was there when everybody could see it. It was plain daylight, until they actually came out and admitted that it existed. So it's the same thing with the military, and it's classified, which is still classified to this day in terms of what they had 50 years ago when it came to their photographic and film technique. So that has to be factored into special effects when it came to the Apollo missions.
Yep.
Yeah. By the way, Randy, do you know that we're getting our own launch pad in Canada?
We're getting our own what?
A launch pad.
Are you going to put Trudeau on there?
No, they're putting a launch pad on the East Coast, right there at Peggy's Cove. You already got a rocket behind you there. That's the one they're going to launch. That one right there.
Oh, interesting. No, I never heard that.
If you look it up, I think it's in Nova Scotia where they're going to build the thing.
That's interesting. And is that working with NASA?
Yeah, NASA's.
Yeah. Well, anyways, we got to move it on. We have to move it along. Christopher A.D., he says, concerning the Van Allen belts, okay, he says, why did the Apollo detectives continue to avoid using related arguments validated by lab tests published by Electric Universe scientists? Well, I'll tell you personally, I don't subscribe to the Electric Universe, and I'll tell you why. I haven't had any time to look into it more. I've heard of it and I've seen some shows on it, but I don't know the entire situation. So I'd have to have a deeper look into that before I can make a decision on that. Now, I see too that there's a bunch, it seems like there's some of the FE Flat Earth community in here that claim that I don't believe that balloons hang on satellites. That's not true. I have shown many videos of satellites being launched on balloons from the North Pole and other places. Sure, they're going to work, but it depends what they're using it for. You cannot have a GPS satellite on a tether on a balloon and have that work. It has to be geostationary in order for that to work. Then the signal comes back to a tower, and then that from there it gets dispersed. It's not that hard to understand, but it can. And by the way, this cannot even work on a flat Earth, and I'll tell you why. Because in the planes that I used to fly, okay, just in the planes I used to fly, now co-piloting, okay, that we had an inertial navigation system on that plane. That inertial navigation system cannot function on a flat Earth. It can't. Because you need specific coordinates before you even take off. that computer is logging those coordinates in, and you can't get that on a flat Earth. It will only happen on a sphere. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So once you're going over the curve of the Earth and you're flying along, the reason why you don't go into space is because you have nav aids on the ground. You have VOR stations, and the aircraft is taking its signal from the VOR stations. You have radio altimeters that tell you not how high you are from sea level, but how far you are from ground level. And that is never going to change as long as you take the readings from that. It's very simple. But anyways, that's a little off topic. That's all I'm going to say on this. So let's move on.
Oh, but you forgot one point. As a fellow pilot, line of sight, VOR's line of sight. So that's affected.
That's right.
It's affected by the curvature of the Earth. So if you're too low and you're a certain distance from the VOR,
it won't work.
You can't pick up the signal. But if you increase your altitude, you can pick up the signal. So
precisely.
Yeah.
And that's why you have different VOR stations along the way.
Yeah.
Right. You might have Bravo. You might have Gypsum. You might have TAC3. You might, there are different names for each one. And usually they're in the 113 frequency, 113.3. They're usually in the 113 megahertz frequency for the VORs. But yes, and so you pick them off as you go over one. Your instrument now reads, instead of from, it reads to.
Yeah.
Okay, you've passed it. Yeah. And then you pick up the next one. But if you're not in line of sight, it's not going to function.
Yeah.
So you have to, Randy, you're right, you have to be high enough for that to pick it up.
So that adds to the, that kind of defeats the flat Earth theory right there. I mean, line of sight.
But anyways, this fellow was actually, Tim T had a comment here that he made. Hi, Tim. How you doing? You must have just got out of bed.
No, he's been on here for the last hour.
Yeah.
No, I know.
Yeah. Hi, Tim. Yeah, it's late for him.
Anyway, Electric Universe is being... okay, Marcus, this might be for you because Tim says the Electric Universe is being discussed in Nexus magazine many times over the years.
Yeah, it has. I've attended lectures on it. I've met, several people connected with it, been at a conference where it was discussed extensively. The electric universe is an interesting area. And maybe the previous questioner, Christopher A.D., might like to give a presentation on the subject. I mean, I'm not very familiar with it myself. I'm aware of its existence, and it makes a great deal of sense in many aspects of science and astronomy and what goes on up in space. And it because it doesn't agree with the mainstream narrative of cosmology, it tends to be dismissed in the same way that the introduction of the flat Earth discussion has been linked with the Apollo faked moon landings, so they can be dismissed as being ridiculous conspiracy theories. No, it was a psyop to introduce Flat Earth. Flat Earth existed about 100 years ago in the UK. There was a Flat Earth Society. It was quite prominent. Didn't mean to say that the Earth was flat. It's just a lot of people discussing it.
Yeah.
Fair enough. People can discuss it. Doesn't mean to say it's for real. We've had people on UK television discussing it. Doesn't mean to say it's real. It's just a subject to discuss. It can be dismissed. It has been. I think many people have looked into it, see if there's any validity to it, and found there isn't, which may upset a few people who might be listening who support the flat Earth position. Doesn't mean to say it's real, unless you can provide sufficient scientific evidence to back up what you're saying, which is what we do about Apollo. We produce scientific evidence that can be confirmed, replicated, duplicated, and discussed. That's what we're here for. It's what we've been doing for the last 10 years.
And Anthony Norris had a good question, I think. He said, during the later Apollo missions, did the astronauts remove their spacesuits in between excursions? If so, it must have been difficult between the two of them. Was it ever on camera? Oh, that's a good one, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I've never seen it. Have you?
No.
No.
Never seen it.
No, when they walked off the set, they went right to the hotel.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Randy?
Well, just to put it into more perspective, the when Marcus was describing earlier the size of the interior of the lunar module, it's misleading for a lot of people because when you go to a space museum, you see a cutout of the lunar module, but you're standing back 15, 20 feet looking at the control panel. It's a bit of a misconception for the people that are seeing there. The actual space between the front of the lunar module inside the cabin to the back was probably about 2.5, 3 feet. Then there was a little gateway in between where they supposedly stored the equipment. Now, as Marcus mentioned, the size of an average car. So picture that 3 feet distance that you had to remove and then put back on your spacesuit. And it has been suggested, and NASA always shies away from this, demonstrated, get an actual mock-up of the lunar module with the space, put a camera inside, and show us how they did it. And they've never done that. They've never rose to the challenge to show us how they put the spacesuits on and then remove the spacesuits.
Well, even if all they removed was their helmet, their gloves, and their boots,
Yeah.
they still had to put the spacesuit on originally.
Yes.
Because they couldn't get through the circular passageway between the command module and the lunar module with a spacesuit on. There wasn't enough room.
And then we have Aquilara Fox here. It says, please take time to talk about the most critical moment in all Apollo mission, the Apollo 17 deep space EVA. How they decompress without losing trajectory or spinning. Now, remember the Apollo 17 EVA when they were outside and they had their cameras out there and they were retrieving the film. This is, I think, what Aquilara is talking about. Yeah. So remember when they were, remember they were when the astronauts, right? They had to get out of the door. And they had to decompress. First, they had to put on the hoses to their suits and then hook it up to the system, the oxygen system, decompress. Then they had to open the door, open the hatch, crawl out, and go all the way to the back of the CSM to pick the film up.
Yeah.
Which, of course, that film had been sitting out there since they took off. It's been out there for 7 days, 8 days, something like that. So this went through the Van Allen belts. It came back through the Van Allen belts, even though they had retrieved it and put it inside. It still got bombarded twice, up and back. Plus all that cosmic radiation that was hitting it while it was out there, supposedly in rotisserie mode. But again, what I don't understand is this, with this question. The Apollo command module itself only had that center door, didn't it? It was the Mercury and Gemini missions that had the two doors that swung open for the two astronauts so they could individually put them in there and take them out.
Gemini.
But now, Gemini. But now you have 3 astronauts in there in that command module. How on earth are you going to get one of those guys out of that door with all those instruments in the way? That whole instrument panel is still in the way of that door, of that hatch. And you've seen how small that is inside there. How are you going to even fit through there with 3 guys in there? There's no room.
Yeah, you actually see that demonstrated too in I think it was Apollo 9 that did the mission that did not leave low Earth orbit. I think it was Apollo 9 when they were supposedly testing out the lunar module, and you see
that's right, and you see all the paper stuff swirl around the guy's head. That's right,
and you see him standing out. Half his body is outside of the command module. And it doesn't occur to you at that moment, but it is a very good question. How did they get that spacesuit on and that backpack on in such an enclosed environment? Well, they could argue that they do it behind the control panel, where I believe where the optics are. But you still have to come back under that control panel and then out through the hatch. And there's no room. It's a very good question. It's a very good question. I mean, this is another aspect that, there's so many details here. There's so many questions about all these details, and that's a very good question. Very good. Again, it goes back to the lunar module. Where did they have the room to put these spacesuits on?
Yes, because the module, the actual, it was actually the command module we're talking about now, because that's still attached to the CSM.
Yeah.
So,
folks, I'll have to wrap up soon. I'm just wondering how long we're going to go. If you can give me some idea.
Yeah, we're just I guess we're
wrap
going to
up
get
at
ready.
any time. We've been here for 2
we're
hours
starting
now.
We figure about 2 hours, and it's 2 hours now. So so if anybody has any other questions they want to ask, so go for it.
Sure.
We just want to, we
How
don't
about
want
we
to
go
miss
for 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Will that be good? And then we can wrap it up?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, great.
Just one question. I got one question.
Yeah.
Can anybody produce incontrovertible, hard, factual evidence that humans have landed on the lunar surface? That I throw it over to anybody who wants to answer that question. Produce the hard, factual, incontrovertible evidence that humans have landed on the lunar surface and returned safely to Earth. We've heard the stories, we've seen the photographs, so it must be real. Can we prove it's real using the scientific method? That's all I ask. I've been asking that question for 30 years. I've yet to have an answer to it. I've got lots of insults. I've got lots of ridiculous ad hominem attacks for asking that question, but it's a perfectly legitimate question. So if anybody can answer it, I'd love to hear it. I throw it open to anybody who wants to try. Thank you.
Right. And then we have Jane McGriff. Here's one. So here's, Jane McGriff. Here's one for Randy. Randy, I would like to ask you a few questions, not directly related to the moon. Do you have an email or anything?
Sure. He can contact me. I don't know if you want to put it up. He can contact me.
I can pop it in the comments here. Sure.
The author Randy email, if you have that, you could put that up there for him.
So it's authorrandy@gmail.
Yeah, so it's authorrandy@hotmail. So it's AUTHORRANDY at hotmail.com. So authorrandy@hotmail.com. So there's 2 R's in the middle there. So authorrandy@hotmail.com.
Okay, great. We got that put up.
Good.
And if he has a problem with the email, just ask him to leave a message on one of your videos, and I'll get back to him. I'll keep an eye out for it.
Sure. Yes. And yes, the Challenger crew they've all passed away, sadly. There was one member of the community that went and actually asked one of the members that supposedly was on that shuttle, and he said no. He says, I was teaching school. They actually went right up to his door and they asked him if he was one of the guys on the shuttle. He said, no. He says, I can prove it. And it's on YouTube somewhere. So anyways, I thought I would ask to put that guy to rest.
It's not quite the same reaction as Bart Sibrel had when he went up to Neil Armstrong.
Oh, no. The fella actually was quite nice about it. He went right onto his property to ask him, are you still alive? Are you this person that was piloting the shuttle? And he said, no. He says, I'm a teacher. I'm a school teacher, university teacher. He says, what would I know about any of that? Yeah. So again, that's YouTube for you. You just can't. You have to really think about things. You just don't just take it for granted. Just look into things.
Yeah.
Don't always grab the first answer.
Yeah. Marcus, when you were saying that we need to have some independent proof that man has landed on the moon, I mean, the only way to get an independent one is to have a company that's not associated with any other space programs be able to launch and send a orbiter there to take a look, right?
Yep.
But the other option to that is why don't these, when they're claiming that they're doing these things, why don't they have offer the media to put on board cameras to record the event?
Yeah.
Like from all nations, everybody's open. Like the technology, what it takes to put a camera on board a vehicle doesn't take up that much energy, space, or weight, right? To record the event. They should have had it on Orion. They should have had, international news media on board with their own equipment to be able to record it, to be able to track it, the whole 9 yards, and do that nice little orbit around the moon.
Yeah. Another thing too,
The
just
cameras
there
they had turned out to be just a CGI crap stuff that was
there's
on
another,
there.
Yeah, there's another, just one last question too that was interesting about Bart Sabrell. Bart's a friend of mine. So what I'll do is I'll ask Bart next time if he can step on. I know he's really busy right now working on a project. I was working on another project with him, so I know he's quite busy. So I'll see if I can't get a hold of him. And actually, he's on Skype right here. He's I've got him here, but his little thing is yellow right now. But in any case, we'll see if I can't get him on next time, and then you guys can throw some questions at him. But anyways, I guess that's about it then, fellas. We'll wrap it up here, and we'll say goodbye to the audience. It was great having you all here. Sorry if I didn't get everybody's comments up here, but it started getting going, and time runs out. Time goes fast.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So we hope that you guys will be here next time when we have another live. So anything else from our panel?
Well, I just say, I think there was a question briefly mentioned, Apollo 13, the famous space rescue. And I've got quite a bit to say about that. The Russians involved as well. And why are the 2 Apollo 13 command modules on public display in America today? One at Grand Rapids in Michigan and one at Kansas Cosmodrome. Why are the 2? It's the only mission that has 2 on display, because the Russians found it and returned it very nicely to America. But why are the 2? Anybody know the answer to that?
Probably
Anyway,
two museums bidding on it so they have it on display.
Yep.
So they had 2 of them made.
But one is sealed till the 300th anniversary of the American Declaration of Independence in 2076, and the other you can see inside. Very interesting. Maybe more of that next time on Apollo 13. So thank you very much for your attention, people. Thank you for your questions. It'll be very interesting questions. I look forward to hearing more of them.
Yeah.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Okay, we'll see you guys all later then.
Yeah.
Okay,
Take care.
bye-bye.
Bye now.